Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and welcome to the LSE South Asia Center, the first event in our term, which now has a new name, the autumn term. And I'm delighted to start off our event this afternoon with our British Academy visiting fellow, Dr. Javed, whom I will introduce shortly. But before that, I'd like to say a very warm welcome to our panelists who are joining us, interestingly, today from across the United Kingdom. And I'm very grateful to them for making the time. I'm not going to say too much about the event, the nature of the event, because Umair is going to do that. I've mostly do this as by way of introduction, but today Umair has very kindly stepped in to do that. But what I did want to say very briefly is that we thought that we would begin with this event in the new term, because this year and the last year has seriously been very tumultuous for Pakistan in several ways. There has been a lot of focus on Pakistan's economy, but it has had devastating floods, which sadly seem to have receded from news coverage at the moment, even though its consequences are felt by the people of the country, and to say nothing about its very, very dramatic political developments. Umair will speak more about it shortly, but before that, may I give a very warm welcome to our audience who are going to join us from across various time zones and with a lot of interest. And we are very, very happy with the interest that you have shown in this afternoon's event. The event is happening via Zoom and is being live streamed on YouTube. You will notice that the chat function has been enabled, so please do ask questions over in the chat function, and we will post them to the panelists once the main discussion has got over. You're welcome to pose questions to individual panelists. You're also welcome to pose questions to the complete panel. If you want to ask a question to a particular speaker, then please do mention them by name. If you would like to tweet, please tag us at SAsiaLSE. The Twitter handles of the speakers are also given against their names in the text that is just below the YouTube screen on which you're watching it at the moment, and you're welcome to tag them as well. I should add here, before I introduce the speakers, that had this event been on site at LSE, LSE allows members of the audience to ask questions without mentioning their name. So in keeping with that spirit, when I ask questions that have been posed by you, I will not be announcing your names, but I will ask the questions exactly as they have been asked. Now, without further ado then, it is my very pleasant task to introduce the speakers this afternoon. We've had a brief chat just now about the order in which the speakers will speak. So the order in which I introduce them is the order in which they will speak. The discussant for this afternoon's event and the curator of the event is Dr. Javed, who is an LSE alumnus. Umair did his PhD from LSE, is currently a British Academy visiting fellow here at the LSE South Asia Center, and is otherwise assistant professor in politics and sociology at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Lahore in Pakistan. Amongst our speakers, our first speaker is Dr. Yasser Kureshi, who is departmental lecturer in South Asian Studies at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford. Dr. Asha Amirali is next, also an LSE alumnus, welcome, and is currently postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Development Studies at the University of Bath. Dr. Mahvish Ahmad is assistant professor in human rights and politics in the Department of Sociology here at LSE and is co-director of LSE Human Rights. Dr. Ayaz Malik is lecturer in human geography in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Liverpool. That's the order in which everyone will be speaking. Umair will speak first, make some brief comments for about 4 minutes, and thereafter we've asked all the panelists to make initial comments for about 6 to 8 minutes, and then there will be a discussion. Once again, you're very welcome to ask questions in the chat box. Umair, please speak now.
Thank you, Nilanjan. Hello, and thank you for attending this event on the futures of Pakistan's democracy. In April last year, Pakistan's populist Prime Minister Imran Khan and his party, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, or the PTI, were removed from office through a vote of no confidence passed by a combined opposition in parliament. As per most observers, the ousting took place after a breakdown of previously close relations between the military high command and the PTI, and as we now know, with tacit approval of the US. The aftermath of this change in government saw large-scale protests by PTI supporters against the military and the new coalition that took power after Khan's removal. These protests were met with harsh crackdowns and violent repression. Several lives were lost, and by some accounts, more than 5,000 party members, including Khan himself, have been incarcerated on a number of public order and corruption charges. Having passed a number of laws expanding the remit of the security apparatus, the coalition government finished its term in August this year, and the country has since been governed by a military-backed caretaker setup that is set to breach its constitutionally mandated tenure of 3 months. General elections, originally scheduled for November, have been delayed to an as yet unspecified date in January next year. A similar violation of the election timeframe had already taken place in 2 of the country's 4 provinces, where legislatures were dissolved earlier this year. These violations leave lingering doubts about the future of procedural democracy in a country that last transitioned out of a military regime in 2008. The breakdown of relations between a ruling party and the military is the latest in patterns of what we call recurring factional infighting within Pakistan's state apparatus. The nature of this destabilizing factional politics rests largely on the outsized political role of the Pakistani military that guards its domestic and foreign policy interests via the suppression of popular mandates, of ethnic and rights-based movements, and other institutional actors such as the judiciary. Frequently, in a bid to undergird its influence and obtain piecemeal legitimacy, the military is able to find willing junior partners within the state and the political elite, as demonstrated by the outgoing incumbents, the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz and the People's Party in recent months, and more prominently, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, or the PTI, in the years earlier. Much of the mainstream conversation around Pakistan's democracy centers around drawing room intrigue and the role of various personalities and office holders. While institutional dynamics, specifically civil-military relations, and increasingly the role of the judiciary, are periodically analyzed, these are rarely put in conversation with other broader phenomena, such as political economy considerations, the persistence of deep-seated socio-spatial inequities in Pakistan's peripheral regions, and more broadly, what we would consider the sociological drivers of politics in the country. Resultantly, existing explanations for recurring political instability rarely go beyond the surface of intra-elite conflict. That seems to be the most convenient explanation that we have with regards to why Pakistan's democratic evolution remains the way it is. So this introduction and today's event, as well as the forthcoming discussion, and we look forward to hearing from the panel, is basically an attempt to instigate a conversation about Pakistani politics that contextualizes democratic derailment and political instability by looking at more historicized institutional and social dynamics. It is, again, an attempt just to simply understand why do these recurring patterns exist beyond simple explanations of ego clashes or intra-elite intrigue, or, as I mentioned earlier, drawing room politics. So I'll stop there with my introductory remarks, and I look forward to hearing from the panel.
Thank you very much, Umair. Thank you also to those members of the audience who've just joined. I can see in front of me. Thank you for joining. And for your benefit, if I could just say once again that you're very welcome to ask questions via the chat box on YouTube, and we will pose them to the speakers once the discussion has begun. It is now my very pleasant duty to once again introduce Dr. Yasser Kureshi, who's our next speaker. Yasser is Departmental Lecturer in South Asian Studies at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford. Yasser, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
Thank you, Nilanjan, and thank you, Ahmad, for having me at this event. I'm excited to be part of this panel and probably start off by introducing the more elite side of the conversation and talking about the intrigue that happened in the military and judiciary. So that'll be my role. And then I look forward to all the conversation we have about all the sociological and other processes that shape that, in that sort of palatial politics. But just to explain, give this background, Pakistan has always been what many scholars have referred to as a hybrid regime, one in which elected power is constrained by unelected tutelary institutions. And sort of the settlements at the core of this national politics have, over the last 30-odd years, revolved around power being primarily organized and distributed between a sort of, and it's a familiar term to many Pakistan observers, a troika of institutional leaders. So for the 1990s, it was the Chief of Army Staff, the Prime Minister, and the President. In the 2010s onwards, this was the Chief of Army Staff, the Prime Minister, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice. Because in this period of the last 20 years, the Supreme Court has progressively expanded the legal grounds for intervening in subjects that fell under the executive and legislative domain, and has increasingly shaped politics and policymaking based on its own preferences. So in this talk, what I want to briefly discuss is how these two primary unelected institutions have participated in and shaped the events that have emerged in the last year and a half. Umair has laid out why the compact between Khan and the military leadership fell apart, and the ripping apart of the same page, as we call it. But what I want to say is, historically, any hybrid order in Pakistan has relied on coordination between the military leadership and the other unelected member of this troika, together using the institutional tools at their disposal to constrain the political parties and enforce the parameters of this order. Whether this was the president, Ghulam Isa Khan, who was a former affiliate of Zia-ul-Haq and closely allied to the military, or it was chief justices like Iftikhar Chaudhry or Saqib Nisar, who both shared the military's disdain for the mainstream PPP and PMLN, and enjoyed the authority and policy influence that came through constraining their political discretion. The compact between two unelected institutions constraining Pakistan's political leadership has been at the core of our hybrid politics. And as the military decided that it was time, or leadership decided it was time to remove and politically isolate Imran Khan, the precondition for carrying out this shift in our hybrid politics in 2022 would have been that there be alignment between Pakistan's unelected tutelary institutions. But this alignment proved elusive in the aftermath of Khan's fall. And the reason, and what we witnessed instead, was clear fragmentation and schisms within the military and judiciary and between the two institutions. So for a decade, the military's propaganda and PTI's propaganda machine had helped construct Imran Khan, the image of Khan, as this embodiment of the military's national political vision. When the military leadership switched allegiances because of its institutional interests, therefore, it became more difficult to convince both segments of the judiciary and the military's own rank and file that had absorbed and internalized critiques of PMLN and PPP, and this idea that Imran Khan was this sort of anti-corruption crusader, that it absorbed these narratives to switch allegiances accordingly. And it became evident that there were segments of the military and Supreme Court that opposed the decision to weaken and contain Imran Khan. So in the judiciary, the Supreme Court Chief Justice appeared not to share the military's leadership's position on politically weakening Khan. A split had appeared within the Supreme Court between judges who were zealous about opposing political corruption and thus sympathetic to Khan's politics, and judges who had opposed Khan's anti-corruption populism as a fig leaf for purging political institutions. This split had already emerged during Khan's tenure, and the differences between these two factions only grew in the coming year. And in this, the Chief Justice's evident partiality in matters of institutional management in favor of judges who belonged to his faction deepened these fissures. So in this context of fragmentation within and between the military and judiciary, the military's re-engineering of the hybrid political settlement grew more challenging, creating the volatile politics we saw between April of last year and May of this year. From May onwards, we saw the military decide to take on a far more aggressively repressive role to reset the political landscape and restore the primary of its interests and authority. The military leadership and the PDM parties, as Umair explained, were unified on debilitating a common adversary, an Imran Khan-led PTI, and neutralizing his supporters within state institutions. And in this process, election dates were ignored, provisions of bail were ignored, and the entire veneer of legality was put to the side. And in this, the judiciary still had to face its own limitations, right? Because the judicial leadership was still relatively pro-Imran Khan, but had to confront the limits of its ability to shape political outcomes in the face of a unified political and military executive, and when confronted with its own internal fragmentation. In August, the military took things further towards managing the political system through establishing a weak, pliable, unelected caretaker government with enhanced policy-making powers and with an expanded ambit to spend a longer time than expected in power. So in this context, the militarized executive branch seems well positioned to manage the controlling of PTI and sort of wiping out support for Khan within state institutions and ending the fragmentation that plagued these state institutions in the aftermath of Imran Khan's fall. But eventually, this centralized military setup is likely to go. After the elections, whenever they happen, even if it is highly engineered, the military will have to deal with several realities. One, an inability to generate external rents to the extent that it is able to in the past, that has been crucial to its ability to maintain its preeminence in politics. Two, an entrenched partisanship that means even if they are able to keep Khan out of power, it may not be that easy to eliminate Khan. Part has become increasingly entrenched in Pakistan's national electorate. And further, given that the terrible state of the economy and the growing demographic of young voters who are aligned with Imran Khan, as Omer, you had explained in an article you yourself wrote recently, which is really interesting, support for Khan is not dissipating at the pace the military would have liked, even with all the defections, press conferences, and cases. And political parties may be willing to side with the military against PTI for now, but those parties are hardly trusting of the military. With PPP, PMLN, and Nawaz Sharif, there are certainly mutual interests between the military and these parties, but this alignment of interest will not be hard to sustain, be hard to sustain for a long time after the elections. And finally, the Supreme Court is now undergoing its own moment of reflection. The current judicial leadership may not be sympathetic to Khan anymore, but neither is it likely to be an easy instrument for the military at this point. At this point, the judiciary is undergoing this moment of dealing with the issue of internal fragmentation through an evaluation of the Chief Justice's powers and individual discretion. But the courts will not be content to simply assume a role where they accept violations of their rulings, violations of their orders, violation of their interests, and as they themselves seek to independently shape and manage political and policy-making institutions and as well. So even as the military has successfully consolidated control over the political system for now, any future hybrid arrangement in Pakistan is going to be shaped by growing partisanship, particularly aligned with PTI currently, reduced external rents, mutual distrust between the military and most of the mainstream political parties, and a judiciary that now sees itself as a tutelary institution in its own right and is not going to be willing to simply be an instrument of military power without any way to shape the politics as it deems necessary as well. In this context, the question to ask, therefore, at the end is, what kind of long-term political settlement can the military engineer that maximizes its interest and authority given these constraints that will remain in place in the coming years? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasser. That was perfectly timed, I have to say. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of the issues that you've raised. Dr. Asha Amirali is an LSE alumnus and is currently postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Development Studies at the University of Bath. Asha, please speak now.
Yeah, I forgot to unmute myself there. Thank you for having me on this very exciting panel. I have a cold, so forgive the quality of my voice. I'm just going to say a few things about Pakistan's economic crisis and the prospects of finding our way out of it. And I should say that I'm not an economist. And I think a large part of the problem, the reason that we have a crisis in part is because we've entrusted the management of our economy solely to economists. And I think any route out of the crisis, therefore, will have to be more interdisciplinary in scholarly terms and much more participatory in political terms. So for those of us who might not have been in the audience, who might not have been following recent events very closely in recent times, I'm not going to say a great deal about what the crisis looks like in Pakistan, but I think the headline really is inflation. Pakistan's been subject to brutal inflation for the last 2.5 years. And it's the highest inflation rate in Asia, and prices of everything have been absolutely skyrocketing. And in part, this has been driven by a very rapid and very damaging currency depreciation that's taken place over the last little while. And Khurram Hussain, who is a very respected journalist, recently noted that the dollar doubled in value. It took 10 years for the dollar to double in value from 75 rupees to 150 rupees between 2008 and 2019. But just in the last 2.5 years, the dollar has doubled again from 150 to 300 rupees. And, you know, when a country has the kind of import-export balance that we have, where we are importing more than twice as much as what we export, you know, the implications of this are enormous. So anyway, I think it's fair to say that there are 3 foundational reasons that land us in this soup at the moment. And one of them is, I think, as Yasser started talking about, is the nature of our political settlement and the mode of governance that it entails. I understand and empathize with and appreciate the need to think about, you know, the relative power of the military vis-a-vis other institutions, absolutely. But I think for the argument that I'm making right now, it actually doesn't matter whether we think the military is slightly stronger or slightly weaker than it was 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 years ago. What matters is that it remains the kingmaker in a large and fiercely competitive pool of political actors. And none of these actors by themselves has the popular strength or the desire to push the military aside and take meaningful control of decision-making. And in large part, this is mainly because all major political parties have strong regional bases, and we don't have a national political party that can forge a national consensus. I mean, Khan is the PTI, and Khan is the closest that we got to this. And then we saw what happened when he kind of overstepped the mark, and the consequences of that are also obvious. But I actually think that it is the nature of this configuration of power at the center, in which the military needs procedural democracy, it needs parties, but given parties' own weaknesses, individual political elites and parties need the military even more to trump the opposition. And I think that this structural imbalance incentivizes and perhaps even necessitates the kinds of short-term instrumental political alliances that we see, in which there's a whole lot of horse trading, there's a whole lot of bargaining, there's a whole lot of bribery and behind the scenes kind of stuff that goes on. And there's little or no returns to policy making, to planning, and to thinking about the various kinds of crises. So basically the point I'm making is that it's this nature of this political settlement that obliterates the possibility of what political economists call a developmental political settlement, in which elites establish a degree of consensus about what the long-term direction of the country is going to be. And this is not a revolutionary or a radical horizon that I'm talking about. It's just kind of what Bangladesh has done, it's kind of what India has done, but we haven't been able to do in Pakistan. The second thing the second foundational reason, and I'll be quick, is debt. I think it's become impossible to talk about Pakistan and talk about Pakistani politics without talking about debt. The country was on the verge of default this summer, and it's fully on course to be right back at that same precipice next year. And in fact, maybe in 2024, we'll actually have default because of the amount of money that we owe. And it's because we don't do anything with the money that we borrow, right? So we don't do anything productive with it. We just use it to pay back interest on loans that we've already taken, or to cover budgetary shortfalls and things like that. And the numbers on this are shocking. The amount that debt repayments take up of the national budget, I'm going to share these figures, not because I think most people don't know them, but because I think they bear mention in a discussion on what we should expect from, and can and should expect from, democratic politics today, okay? So this year, debt servicing is 55% of the national budget, 55% of total expenditure, national expenditure. Defense is about 20%, and sort of running the government is about 17%. So that leaves 8% for everything else. So that's health, education, social services, energy, everything. So that's the kind of fiscal space that we're talking about, these sort of nominally procedurally democratic forces that they have to work with to deal with the economic crisis. I also just want to very briefly say that I don't think the problem of debt is just an economic problem. It's also an epistemic problem. It's a problem of knowledge. It's a problem of power, because it locks us into particular ways of seeing and doing that are privileged by the creditors. Okay, and I think in Pakistan, the power sector epitomizes the disastrous consequences of this. The fact that it remains business as usual in the power sector, in the face of repeated, dramatic, and extremely costly failure over the last 3 decades is not unconnected to the fact that loans come with technical assistance, they come with consultants, and then these same consultants have been sitting in the various ministries and regulatory bodies for the last 3 decades. And they're basically saying that the government's job is not to undertake generation, is not to undertake transmission and distribution. It is instead to de-risk capital such that capital can come and do all of these things. I'm not saying that debt relations are the only reason that, we have no other way of thinking about this in the country despite the failure, but I don't think it's inconsequential. So I think debt has to be front and center in our conversations. And this brings me to the third foundational problem. I'll be very quick. There is basically no alternative to the vision of development that has got us to where we are today, okay? And this is a vision of infrastructure development, consumption growth. There's no plan, no intention, no interest in, and obviously no fiscal space for domestic productivity growth, no plan for labor-intensive, employment-generating, skill-enhancing, productivity-enhancing sectors like education and healthcare. There is no plan to diversify exports away from bed sheets and rice, which is what makes up the bulk of our exports. And there's not even a whiff of the concept of social and ecological regeneration. And there is surprisingly little debate, even amongst academics like ourselves, about the merits and demerits of defaulting on our debt. And even temporarily attempting to take some space away from the global economic system. And so just to end, I think that this raises 2 really important strategic questions. And the first is there any point in engaging existing nominally democratic forces on doing things differently? How much strategic agency do we think that they actually have within, some of what I've just described? And secondly, if we think that they don't have much agency, and I'm not even talking about their intention, and we think that those at the helm are not going to change course, then what should we be doing? I mean, we know what the small, tiny, politically irrelevant left is trying to do, and they're doing it to the best of their ability, which is to build a mass popular movement, which is in reaction to violence and expropriation and the most extreme forms of exploitation. But what should we be doing? So this is just something to think about, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asha, and thank you for doing this, despite your cold. Very briefly, we've started getting questions, so I'm once again inviting members of the audience to send us questions via the chat function, and also that if you're using abbreviations, it may be useful for the benefit of other members of the audience if you kind of spelled out what those abbreviations were. This is to people who are asking questions, not just to the speakers. Thank you very much, Asha. We'll come back to a lot of what you've said. Our next speaker is Dr. Mahvish, Ahmad, who is Assistant Professor in Human Rights and Politics in the Department of Sociology here at the London School of Economics, and is now also co-director of LSE Human Rights. Mahvish, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Umair for organizing this panel. And unfortunately, I too have a cold, so excuse me if I'm going to be a little bit, the voice sounds a bit strange. I want to start off just by picking up a point that Umair brought up in his opening remarks, which is the tendency to talk about politics, about democracy, and about economics from the perspective of intra-elite conflicts, from an issue that primarily has to do with a few select parties, their leaders, and sometimes their supporters, usually concentrated in urban centers, and especially in Punjab. So I come to this panel as a scholar who primarily works on militarization and state violence on Pakistan's peripheries, in particular Balochistan, which for those less aware, perhaps, southern Pakistani province has been a site of disappearances, extrajudicial killings, and army operations for well over 20 years, and has a longer history of violence and of the deficit of democratic autonomous self-rule within even the puzzle of the federal Pakistani state in democratic periods, and also have some experience working as a journalist further up on the border around the former federally administered tribal areas and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Now, from the vantage point, of course, of these Pakistani peripheries who have been subject to state violence, especially in the form of these disappearances and extrajudicial killings, and the inability to represent themselves within political assemblies fully, the current political crisis in particular, but also the broader economic crisis that Asha spoke of, is a generalization of conditions under which they have lived for over 2 decades, if not longer. So this is both the case in terms of the very brutal and direct and sort of spectacular modes of violence that we're seeing right now, which the army has been using against PTI workers who've been visited and abducted from their homes, harassed and tortured over the past couple of months. Over the past 20 years, we've seen similar kinds of abductions happening in Balochistan, where I primarily work, and these abductions go on parallel to all those that are happening against PTI workers as well. And of course, also in Pashtun populations, in Sindhi populations, and also in other kinds of political groupings and ethnic groupings within Pakistan that have either stayed kind of ethnically, politically, linguistically, socially, or culturally marginalized, or have in some way fallen out of favor. And here, for example, we can think of MQM in Karachi, which also fell out of, once in alliance with the military, fell out of favor, and then was subject to similar levels of abduction and killing for the purposes of trying to remove them as a viable political force in Karachi. And this is something that some of the very important organizers from these peripheral movements have noted. And I was trying to find a tweet by Mama Qadir, who's one of the main voices of the Voice for Baloch Missing Persons movement, expressing his solidarity with PTI workers, but also noting in a delicate way that it is a generalization of conditions in the periphery that have now come to the center. Now, there are those direct methods of violence, those techniques of violence that has earlier been reserved to be deployed on these populations that we are now seeing coming into the very heart of Punjab and even being deployed. I would say perhaps not yet to the extent as we see it on Baloch activists, but to quite a large extent, even on, for example, daughters and sons of military families, given that the military is internally split on the question of Imran Khan. But other than these direct techniques of violence being used, there's also a way where conditions within Balochistan, I'm going to primarily talk about Balochistan as an example, have also, in a sense, foreshadowed a little bit what has been happening here. Now, if you think about the provincial government there in the aftermath of Musharraf, there was a hope in 2010 with the 18th Amendment and the decentralization of political power, the decentralization of some form of economic decision-making to the provinces, that you would finally begin to see a provincial government in Balochistan that would be able to exercise some form of self-rule. And you subsequently had the election in 2013, where the National Party, consisting of a series of quite active Baloch nationalist politicians who were not considered sort of your regular partners of the military, but who were trying to push for greater autonomy, political autonomy of Balochistan, come into power and take government. There was some tiny glimmer of hope that that may finally lead to a kind of self-rule, that Baloch nationalists still willing to work within the framework of Pakistan, because of course there's also many people wanting to separate, that they finally will have a chance to exercise some kind of political and economic autonomy. But what happened, and what continues to happen, is that that did not realize itself. That what instead happened was that the National Party, which was the party that came into government, found out very quickly that they have no power in their hands. And soon after that, neither did they come back into government, but a couple of years later, you basically had various kinds of military sanctioned or military backed political parties come into power. And currently, of course, the main political party that is backed by the military is that of the caretaker prime minister in the form of the Balochistan Awami Party. Instead, what you had in Balochistan, which many, I think, especially Baloch activists, if you listen to speeches, as well as many others, Pashtun activists might also say in speeches, is a situation there which many have described as a chowni or an army camp, a situation of total and utter military dominance in Balochistan. Though I still think that it's primarily concentrated in the peripheries, you have some indication, a very strong sense of this now stretching into the cities in the form of checkpoints, in the form of higher levels of securitization, and of course, direct forms of violence. If you also think about it, other than the political setup, which I think I actually just want to quickly also mention something about the concept of the hybrid regime, which has been sort of a concept that really emerged in the aftermath of Imran Khan, as Imran Khan being this figure who was who represented for a brief moment the success of the hybrid regime. And there's various kinds of conversations on, are we in a hybrid regime 2.0 now, or are we actually in a period of direct military dominance? I think that's a very useful conversation, but often I think that it doesn't take into consideration that the military regime is geographically uneven in Pakistan, and that what may be a hybrid regime in Punjab or in Karachi is just direct military coercion in the peripheries. It is not hybrid in FATA, or former FATA, it was not hybrid. It is not hybrid in Balochistan. And I think that that's an important point to remember, because what I would like to put forward as a kind of hypothesis, because the title of today's event is, what does democratic leadership and I guess politics look like in Pakistan, is as long as you have that level of military dominance of the peripheries, then the military will always have the chance to bounce back into the center of politics. Until democracy is properly established in the peripheries of Pakistani politics, of Pakistani geographies, we will never be able to truly secure it. And it's almost as if it is in waiting out there in the peripheries. Even if things start looking democratic in the center, as long as they're militarized in the peripheries, they're going to come back. And this is actually, if you make a kind of a conceptual comparison to places like the UK, the US, or India, as long as you have a militarized Kashmir, you will have the potentiality for as long as you have police violence on Black people in the US, as long as you have anti-immigrant violence in Europe, you always have the chance for a kind of a violent state apparatus. The final thing I want to say, just in terms of some of this sense of, clearly in the peripheries, you have both direct military violence, you have a sense of no political self-rule, but you also, of course, have a sense of no economic self-rule or no economic sovereignty. So on a national level, what Asha talks about in terms of debt, in terms of having a feeling that we also don't really have control over our own economic situation, that's also very much concentrated in these peripheries. And you have the interesting thing about a place like Balochistan is that it has this dual place in the Pakistani imagination and in the narrative of the military as both being a space that could potentially undo the country because of separatist, foreign-funded separatist militant violence, but also a place that could save the country because of Gwadar port or because of various kinds of mining or gas fields. Now, when it comes to those kind of economic projects, there's also constantly a taking away of autonomous self-rule and self-government or decision-making about them. And through those narratives, the military has retained control over what sort of decisions around Gwadar Port, decisions around Reko Diq, and the Sui gas fields. The last, I want to sort of end also with a kind of a question, which is, you know, can we, and I think too often the conversation about conditions in the peripheries gets sidelined. It gets kind of dismissed as sort of a detail, and we know that's happening, but let's talk about, you know, real politics now. Let's not talk about that. And one of the ways that the debate around the crisis over the last few months has been framed, quite unfortunately, has been in a kind of a binary. On the one hand, you have PTI and Imran Khan supporters being very upset that anybody is pointing out that this crisis, in a sense, isn't unprecedented because it has a history on Pakistani peripheries. And on the other hand, you have people insisting that using Pakistani peripheries to dismiss the fact that there is real violence happening on PTI workers. And I think that we need to probably move beyond this very unhelpful way of speaking about the crisis, and instead try to chart out, you know, if we are going to move towards a democratic future, what kind of alliances do we need to forge, not just between, you know, there's all sorts of talk about the necessity of democratic alliances between some of the mainstream political parties, but what kind of alliances do we also need to form politically with the peripheries and peripheral regions in order to push back the power of the military? And I think, you know, given that we're going to Ayaz, who works on Gramsci, it's also about the creation of a historical bloc that thinks about, you know, alliances between center and periphery.
Thank you very much, Mahvish. That was a perfect segue to our last speaker. And before that, once again, an invitation to ask questions, but our last speaker on the panel is Dr. Ayaz Malik. Ayaz is lecturer in human geography in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Liverpool. Ayaz, please speak now.
Okay, can you hear me, everyone? Yeah, okay. Thank you so much to all the friends who've invited me here. And for the privilege of being the last speaker, I might inflict the pain upon you to speak a bit over the time limit that I've been assigned. Now, with the mainstream commentary, Umair has already mentioned, and both in the mainstream commentary, and I'm not as competent in speaking impromptu, so I've written something up, so I'll, you know, there'll be a hint of reading something off a page. So I apologize in advance for that. Now, as Umair said already, and you know, as we've been discussing, mainstream commentary in Pakistan, and even a lot of critical observers, do get stuck on intra-elite machinations when talking about, you know, the politics. Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you because you are speaking through two devices. You need to switch the camera on the one that you have switched off, because otherwise you're not showing up on the live stream. So
okay.
So you just need to switch the camera. You need to switch the camera on both, and then speak with the audio one.
Okay, let's see if this works.
Yes.
Okay, does it work?
Yeah, it works. And now
there's two of me now.
Yeah, okay. My apologies to everyone for the interruption.
That's fine. Okay, so as Umair has already indicated, and other friends have said as well, mainstream commentary and even a lot of critical observers do get stuck on intra-elite machinations when talking about Pakistan. On the scholarly side, you know, at a schematic level, this might be kind of a legacy, a hangover of the Hamza Alabian framework, which is the most influential theorization of Pakistani polity and the state, designating the latter as a so-called overdeveloped state, which Asim Sajjad Akhtar, tongue-in-cheek, has also called an overdeveloped legacy. In this framework, there is a focus more on intra-elite conflict and mediations, or what we would call horizontal class struggle over vertical class struggle. That is a view of the social formation as a whole. However, it is only with the latter, that is only by delineating how shifts and struggles over the wider social sphere culminate within the apparatuses of the state and political society, that we can get a holistic understanding of the situation that we are in today. Now, I will speak in broad and schematic terms here, and we can discuss in more detail later. So in this case, we can start from two places. One is the wider historical and structural, specifically the world systemic placement of the Pakistani polity and social formation. Or on the other hand, and which actually I think leads us in the same direction, we can ask the question of how the Pakistani ruling bloc rules, that is, what are the mechanisms and apparatuses through which it secures hegemony, and indeed, what are its hegemonic capacities, that is, the social and economic space it has to generate some level of popular consent and absorption for its rule. Now, if one looks at this question in the historical longue durée, what is most apparent is that Pakistani ruling bloc, like several other peripheral and post-colonial ruling blocs, does not have a coherent national project of its own. And by this, I mean fundamentally a project of accumulation which forms sustainable basis of agreement at the top and provides some concessions at the bottom. Indeed, in the absence of an expansive hegemonic project, it is actually their particular mode of insertion into the imperial world order that has provided them temporary moments of coherence and respite. Thus, even in the AU period, where there is some kind of identifiable, though ultimately failed project of developmentalism and some sort of import substitution industrialization, this is majorly funded by the US and through the exploitation of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. In fact, the strong claim that I want to make here is that since the separation of East Pakistan and the exhaustion of 1960s ISI, the Pakistani ruling and the discounting the Bhutto interregnum, which we can discuss later if you want, the Pakistani ruling bloc has basically been beset by a long-term structural crisis. That is one of the absence of a coherent national project, which encompasses not just ideology and culture, but a genuinely national economy. Sustainable basis of accumulation and expansive hegemony thus foregone, the Pakistani polity has one, low intensity, often fraying mechanisms of generating popular consent and absorption, and two, is thus structurally geared to tending towards the use of coercion in order to provide coherence to the social formation. In this, the historical insertion into the world order is of a particular kind among peripheral countries, that is serving as US imperialism's local gendarmerie in the region. Dependency here operates not as a structural fact, but as a historical process, as a matrix of action, or as it may inaction, conditioning the probability of some outcomes over others. It is this coming together of historical structural incapacity with particular modes of imperial mooring that underlie what is usually termed the civil-military imbalance in Pakistan. Thus, in contrast to much liberal hand-wringing over constitutional ambits and the civilians' repeated compromises with the military, the civil-military imbalance in Pakistan is neither a zero-sum game, a merely subjective failing of political actors, nor simply about the rapaciousness of the Praetorian Guard, although it is that too. Fundamentally, the civil-military structuring of the political terrain is an index of the ruling bloc's wider social and imperial mooring in the absence of sustainable accumulation projects, the lack of hegemonic capacity, and the resulting tendency towards reliance on ideological hyperbole and coercive authoritarianism. The problem is thus much more deep-rooted and indeed much more serious than the low-intensity structural explanations proposed by liberal and often even by critical intellectuals. Once we start looking at the polity and the political terrain in this historical, structural, and indeed imperial perspective, the structural and organic crisis that the Pakistani ruling bloc faces today can be more productively understood. A crisis, and as Antonio Gramsci reminds us, can last for decades, with conjunctural and punctual forces struggling to either conserve the old order through the age-old strategy of the more things change, the more they remain the same, or to construct a new one. In this at least half a century long crisis of the ruling bloc, imperial aid has arrived at opportune moments to provide conjunctural salve to structural incapacities. From the Afghan jihad to so-called war on terror to the now fading hopes via the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, imperial and sub-imperial patronage has served to shore up the incoherence of the ruling bloc while further integrating the social formation and polity into the world system on unequal and specifically militarized terms. Now, with the imperial moorings of the world order itself in flux, and especially US imperialism's shifting regional focus onto Eastern Europe and East Asia, the regional gendarmerie role of the Pakistani ruling bloc is reaching an ignoble end. Imperial aid drying up and peripheral integration into globalization through such unconventional means now faltering, the long-term incoherence, the gestating structural crisis is manifesting itself more directly in the political terrain. It is in this sense that the Imran Khan project was such a contradictory one. At one and the same time, an index of the lack of absorptive capacity of the system, which provides grist to populist upsurges, the last and now failed point of coordination between Pakistan's middle classes, popular classes, and the reigning ruling bloc, and also the latest attempt of the militarized ruling bloc to conserve itself through absorption and dissipation of energies through a popular figure, although to be sure a popular figure of the right. In sum, the PTI and its ostensible unraveling is an index of the overflow of the social, beyond its established coordinates of recognition and mediation. And thus it is true that with the inevitable unraveling of the hybrid 1.0 project, the Imran Bajwa project, and the falling through of the wider social and imperial moorings of the political terrain, we see a grotesque and dizzying array of alignments, with Democrats of yesteryear becoming hybriders of today, dictators spawn of many generations, Umar Ayyub, Yazul Haq, and so on, now on the ostensible side of anti-establishment. Punctual maneuverings and imperial cement thus no longer able to paper over structural cracks, the incoherence of the ruling bloc is laid bare for all to see. Here, as we are familiar through long historical experience, the preference and usual modus operandi of the ruling bloc is one of muddling through. Get concessions from one imperial or sub-imperial patron, aid from there, and write-offs from another. There is nothing that the Pakistani ruling bloc excels at better than obtaining temporary respite for kicking the proverbial can down the road. The Special Investment Facilitation Council, the groveling before Gulf dictatorships, the desperate maneuverings to get back into Yankee good books, for example, by selling arms to NATO's Ukrainian kind of satraps, the punctual grumblings against 18th Amendment and fiscal federalism, all these are part of a search for temporary coherence, the same impulse to move without movement, survive without change, and live without dynamism. However, the wider lay of forces is such that in the medium to long term, stark choices and paths are now presented to the ruling bloc. The first path, and this is about the future, of course, the first path would be a deep-rooted program of structural change. This would not follow the IMF's mantra of export-oriented growth and integration into global markets, as Asha was also indicating towards. Indeed, it is the insertion of Pakistan into the world system that has led to the present crisis. This alternative scenario would entail a program of what Samir Amin has called delinking. That is, building an economy genuinely geared towards fulfilling national needs, building linkages between agriculture and industry, labor-absorbing forms of industrialization, even nationalization of key sectors. And all of these steps are predicated on raising effective demand at home, which would entail a minimum program of land reforms in both urban and rural areas. Obviously, such a basic program of internally focused development and getting out of the grips of imperialist dependency would require a very different coalition of class forces in power. The other scenario would see the Pakistani ruling bloc go full tilt on IMF-style economic restructuring, entailing liberalization, privatization, and austerity. This would mean a further round of dispossession and extraction from the subordinate classes and from Pakistan's many peripheries. This would be sure to generate social and political unrest among the popular classes, but also among sections of the elite that stand to lose out from this whole-scale restructuring. Such widespread unrest could only be quelled through a ferocious program of coercion akin to a Pinochet or Zia-type dictatorship. This would discipline the popular classes, of course, but importantly also parts of the dominant bloc to ensure integration into the imperial world system on terms that are still unequal, but differently so. There is, however, only one actor in the Pakistani polity that has the capacity to carry out such a program, even if that. This is a scenario to be feared, but one which the structural incapacity of the Pakistani ruling classes is bringing more and more into the realm of possibility every day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ayaz. Umair, I'm going to now invite you and also to remind you that you're, of course, very welcome, even as discussant, to first begin with making your own comments that you may want to before you foster the discussion for the benefit of members of the audience who have since joined, because Umair spoke very briefly at the start. Dr. Umair Javed is an LSE alumnus, having done his PhD over here, is currently British Academy Visiting Fellow here at the LSE South Asia Centre, and is Assistant Professor in Politics and Sociology at the Lahore University of Management Sciences in Pakistan. Umair, please speak.
Thank you, Nilanjan, and thank you to Yasser, Asha, Mahvish, and Ayaz for their very insightful comments. I sort of particularly like the fact that this has come together in the way and the flow that sort of, we've structured the conversation and the order that we sort of went in. I think Yasser pointing out the kind of incoherence that is now racked various kinds of state institutions, so whether it's the judiciary and the military, the partisanization, so to speak, to use a clunky term, of these institutions, and how that limits their ability to intervene coherently in the political formation. Asha's point, and I think the first point that Asha made in particular is quite relevant, which is the inability of Pakistan's political settlement to move towards a developmental political settlement. It seems that the current configuration of power, as it is sort of as it's currently shaped, simply produces structural crises, episodically, and it actually in some ways precipitates. Asha, I know you mentioned this, but I really want to sort of force the point home that it precipitates the kind of hybridization of politics that we see on a regular basis, that people have to cut these alliances and these obviously short-term deals precisely because there is nothing else to extract from the system itself, because the system is mired under its own lack of productivity, so to speak. Mahvish's point, I think, brings in this much needed perspective of understanding, while we lament the decline of or demise of Pakistani democracy, it's relevant and important to understand that this demise had perhaps always been in place for many Pakistanis and for many different parts of the country, as it were. And I think any idea of a new political settlement, which is one that rests on popular mandates and that promises autonomy and political citizenship and universal political citizenship, cannot be imagined without consideration of those peripheral areas that have been subjected to uneven militarization for the better part of 2 decades, but perhaps one could argue probably since partition. And then finally, Ayaz's sort of point about the last point in particular, Ayaz, that you mentioned, the two stark choices that have been laid out. The first being a switch towards or perhaps a remodeling of how the political economy compact in Pakistan actually works, versus a sort of a double downing on of sorts on a coercive Pinochet / Zia model in a bid to extract more rents. And it seems that in the last 6 to 8 months, that is the model that has been perhaps, if not adopted, then that is the indication that we are seeing. I have questions for all 4 panelists, and I'll try to keep this as brief as possible, and you can take some time to sort of respond to them. The first is for Yasser, which is on this fracturing and incoherence within state institutions. Now, all of our panelists, and in particular Asha and Ayaz, have mentioned that the state apparatus will inevitably have to play some form of a coordination role if we are to move out of a crisis to something that is more sustainable. Do you see the judiciary in particular as being an actor that is currently capable of changing sort of the nature of the existing political moment towards something that protects and guarantees at least fundamental rights in the short to medium term? Asha, your point about sort of a developmental political settlement, I just want to push you on that a little more and really sort of, I guess, put you on the spot and wonder what it would take for a developmental political settlement to emerge in the first place. Does it take a crisis of the sort that maybe Bangladesh had in both from obviously a genocidal civil war, but also the 74 natural disaster, or does it take something like the kind of financial crisis that India had in the late 1980s and early 90s? What really are the external conditions that would allow for something like that to happen? To Mahvish, I think when we're often talking about sort of these larger elite-led settlements taking place, in the metropolitan areas such as Lahore and Karachi and Islamabad, are there sort of movements that you think that are in sync with more inclusive approaches and towards understanding how a new political settlement could be approached? And more importantly, are we seeing any indication whether there could be a broader coalition between mainstream political entities and these existing movements that could perhaps deepen the quality of representative politics in the country? And then finally, as I know so this is, I guess, a partly academic argument, which is that when we theorize the ruling bloc in Pakistan, we obviously ascribe a lot of importance and agency to the Pakistani military. But what do you think are the limitations of thinking about the ruling bloc from that particular perspective, of thinking about the military as this sort of agent or autonomous actor? And B, if you think that as an autonomous actor, it will continue to exercise a great deal of control. Do you think that the popular upsurge that we're currently witnessing, that is enshrined through the personality of Imran Khan and his political party, do you think that popular upsurge represents a different type of or an alternative, so to speak, to the coordination responsibility that we normally see within the ruling bloc itself? So I'll just stop there. Yeah, we can take turns to sort of answer those questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Amir. That was great. Shall we just do the one round of answers in the order in which you asked the questions, and then we have at least one question from a member of the audience, and then we may have more while people are responding to your queries, and then we can go through another round of questions if we have the time. Right, Ayaz, go for it. No, sorry. Yasser, you're going to, sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you so much, Amir. And really enjoyed hearing all the fantastic insights from all the panelists, and yeah, really lots to learn and think about from this panel. And I think to your question about sort of the way the judiciary can it play a coordinating role in sort of this like in the future, that coordinating role that may be necessary to have a coherent state play the role that it needs to play in sort of directing Pakistan's future politics and development. I think, so my answer would be probably, I would be pessimistic, let's say, about what role the courts can play in that regard, for two reasons. One, a coordinating role would require the courts to also, so the kind of role that the courts decide to play must be one that is amenable to the idea that, how would I put it? That the kind of political decisions should be in the hands of sort of more representative, deliberative institutions. And that is something, first of all, that our courts tend to be skeptical of, right? Our courts tend to try to shift decision-making away from institutions of, as much as they can from the political parties, to the extent that they can from what they see as, the sort of political forums and deliberative forums as much as they can. And I think that kind of misallocation would mean that the kind of coordination that they would do could be quite problematic. If anything, they would try to, and I think that might be one issue with the courts. But then on the other point you mentioned about regarding fundamental rights, right? I think that this is a complex one because on the one hand, I think what we saw in the last year was that the military, etc., have been relatively comfortable with ignoring and bypassing the Supreme Court where needed, right? So the court says something, they ignore, they move on. I'm not sure that is something that could be, I can't predict, but I don't think that's something that would be sustainable in the long term. There would be a place that the judiciary, given the power it has gotten increasingly accustomed to in the last 20 years and the kind of consequences it wants to see of its power and the efficacy of its power it's gotten used to, I don't think the judges would be very comfortable with that. And I think you will see pushback on that coming over time. And I think that's where sort of the courts can set some very broad red lines for what, the militarized executive can ultimately get away with. So for example, we don't see full-scale military coups that kind of suspend the constitution, largely because if you want to co-opt judicial actors into any settlement, they're not going to be happy anymore with accepting an entire wholesale suspension of the constitution because that's the source of their authority and power, right? So to that extent, that sort of need to keep judges sort of on your side does create for the military and militarized executives some limits on what they can do and how they can exercise their power. But what they've chosen to do instead for the last year is rather than simply suspending the law, it's kind of just ignoring it. And I think they've gotten away with that right now, but that's partly because the courts have been so fragmented internally themselves. And I think as that issue starts resolving itself, as the courts start pick up pieces of what they put themselves through over the last 3 years and how implicated they were in the politics of Imran Khan's 3 years and kind of the aftermath of that, I think we may see the court start pushing back again, as they have before. We saw this in General Zia's time, right? 77, 78, you have the court sort of wholesale writing off, signing off on everything Zia is doing, right? And 79, you start seeing high courts picking up many cases, gradually challenging the way in which the Zia regime sort of, operates, the kind of what the military courts were doing, trying to push back, reassert its jurisdiction. I mean, you even have the Balochistan High Court saying that the military cannot it cannot amend the constitution the way it chose to, right? It was a pretty dramatic pushback against the military at that time. And at that time, the kind of power the judiciary had wasn't as embedded and institutionalized as it has become today. So I think that pushback will likely come. I can't make predictions, but if I was to base this on the history of the judiciary, there's only so long before they start looking to reassert the authority that they've gotten accustomed to. And that sets certain red lines.
Thank you. Asha?
Yeah, thanks. Omer, you've thrown me a really tough question there. I mean, it's an evil question, actually. And I think, and what I understand you to be asking me is, under what conditions could we see a developmental political settlement in Pakistan? And I think the obvious answer is that, a political settlement that doesn't include the military. But that's not about to happen, because the only way, there is no national political consensus that I can see evolving. Mahvish just told us some very good reasons why that wouldn't be the case. And despite the fact that, there is this inter-institutional tussle that, Yasser very wonderfully describes, and historically, like, I don't see how that will then translate into this sort of greater national consensus on the basis of which we can oust the military and erect something that, as simple as, if you look at Bangladesh, the military is part of the political settlement, okay? But it is not the kingmaker. It is not a central pivot around which other political actors pin their strategy. That stopped being the case, just a little over 2 decades ago, right? And India, the military doesn't figure in the same way. You look at Rwanda, you look at Ethiopia, you look at the examples of where you have these sort of successful developmental political settlements, and you don't have a violent, extractive military of our sort at the center of it. So, I mean, this is not a great answer. I get it, but I mean, it's the truth.
Okay, Mahvish.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for your question, Omer. I think I basically agree with Asha, right? There isn't, you asked me if there's any movements that are more inclusive and any kind of, I don't know. It looks just quite dark right now because, yeah, you have each of these political parties at various points making deals with the military of some sort or another. What I do want to say is that there is, I think if I was to sort of roughly classify 3 major sets of movements at the moment coming up from the grassroots that are really trying to push back the power of the military. It is, of course, the demographics of it is a middle class, especially a middle class young demographic that faces a future that looks ecologically, economically very, very dark, politically very dark. And it's interesting that, on the one hand, it's sort of young PTI workers who now suddenly find themselves no longer friends with the military. Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, also young middle class, middle working class as well, but definitely a lot of Pashtuns from former Fatah who ended up migrating into the cities and have been politicized there. And then Baloch middle class as well. And each of these 3 different formations initially took 3 different types of political faces. So PTI workers were organized within a kind of political party, and the PTM in sort of a grassroots constitutional movement. And the Baloch movement is primarily insurgency and separatist movement. And each of them, and also sort of calling for political autonomy. And there has on that level, on the peripheries, right? On the periphery, so I'm not talking like mainstream, but on the peripheries, there are various kinds of conversations and sitting down together between missing persons movements. You'll have Pashtun Tahaffuz movement going to Baloch missing persons rallies that are quite promising in a way, but also, unfortunately, I don't think will yield very much. At least that's what it looks like right now. But what it does remind me of is historically, if you go all the way back to the 50s, is of course the National Awami Party, before the PP, the Pakistan People's Party in particular, as being a potential sort of left-wing political formation that had all sorts of peripheral, you could call it almost like a pan-peripheral political party with Bengali, Pashtun, Baloch, some Punjabi Sindhi sort of representation, but that would be a hope, but it doesn't look like that. So there is some kind of conversation there, and it's much more inclusive in that way, but it is, peripheral. And as long as you don't have a proper alliance with inside Punjab in particular, and there the major political parties are not, they're ready to broker the power of the military, then it doesn't look like that's about to happen, sadly.
Umair, were you going to say something?
No. I just thought, yeah, that's a great response, Mahvish. Thanks.
Okay. Ayaz, you need to switch on your other. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Umair, for the question. I mean, in terms of the question about understanding the military as an autonomous actor, in fact, this is exactly what I'm saying should not be happening, right? That unfortunately, this civil military thing is seen as a zero-sum game. When what I'm saying is that actually we have to understand the tendency towards authoritarianism. We have to understand the wider social and imperial mooring of the polity of the social formation itself. So on the one hand, it's the social incapacity, the structural incapacity, the lack of material self-abnegation of the reigning dominant classes, which then again tends towards the use of authoritarianism. And then historically, it's then the imperial coddling, which then centers a particular coercive actor at the center of the polity and makes it the articulatory kind of principle of the whole ruling bloc, which then in Pakistan's case is the Pakistani military. So it's exactly the autonomy or the autonomous position given to the military in a lot of mainstream accounts that I'm actually, arguing against, number one. And of course, it is also this is also why, once we start placing these things, the polity into this wider kind of social and imperial mooring, we can then understand as to why the divisions have appeared with the Khan project, right? That, while this imperial salve or whatever, imperial cement, whatever you want to call it, has been fraying, has been giving way, and of course, because of other more proximate factors as well, we have the populist insurgency of the Khan through the mid 2000s, early 2010s, and so on and so forth. And of course, where was I? And it's also this kind of, because of this kind of wider mooring falling away, we can see the cracks, which developed within the military itself, and which Khan, almost, one can say the cracks, the fractures were capitalized upon, or they were almost capitalized upon, right? And I think, but even with those cracks developing, even with those wider imperial social moorings falling away, of course, economics and politics don't work in a lockstep manner, right? They don't follow each other in a one-to-one determinative fashion. There's, proximate long-term factors and proximate factors and historical longue durée and so on and so forth. So even with those divisions, I think military, as we know, remains the most powerful actor, right? It is not just an institutional force; it's a social force. It's like 1 million people with all the networks of contractors and all the workers which are hired for propaganda and so on, and the families of the people who are involved in these networks and so on and so forth. And it is this social force, as I said, that Imran Khan phenomenon fractured, as almost threatened to fracture, and which is also why, because of these deep fractures, the deep-seatedness, the coercion has to be deep-seated, right? Which is what the danger that I was pointing to, what you also pointed towards, that if the direction that we are tending towards is a very dangerous direction, because it's exactly the principal guarantor, the mediatory moment of the ruling bloc. Once that fractures, then everything is up in the air. So that is the dangerous moment that we find ourselves in, and also because of that, because of the long-term structural crisis and the way they are manifesting themselves in the political terrain, in other terrains, I genuinely think that Pakistani politics is now moving towards a new conjuncture, right? In a very concrete way, the way after Bhutto's judicial murder, Pakistani politics for the next 2 to 3 decades became organized around Bhutto, anti-Bhutto nodes. Of course, the Imran Khan phenomenon is both similar and different in many ways. But over the short to medium term, it seems that the Pakistani politics will be organized around the nodes of Khan. And that is in one sense very similar to the Bhutto, aftermath of Bhutto, and that's to do with the shifting kind of generational shifts, and also, as I said, the wider, long gestating structural crisis of the ruling bloc, which is now manifesting itself. So yeah, definitely not for the autonomy of the military.
Okay, thank you very much, Ayaz. We have one question, which is for all of you, starting with Asha, because the question actually says at Asha and others. So Asha, perhaps you should speak first, and then we'll give everyone, including Umair, you the chance to speak. And then we could, Umair, if you want, do another round of short questions. We have about 10 or 12 minutes more to go, and then we can end. The question is this. I'm just going to read it out as it is written. What are your views on the newly established SIFC, that's Special Investment Facilitation Council, particularly with respect to its recently widened mandate? Asha, you want to go first?
Thank you. So the SIFC is a 25 or 50 billion fund, as I think those who are asking the question know, but I'm explicating for those who don't, that has been set up by the hybrid, in hybrid format. So it's to be a Special Investment Facilitation Council led by Chief of Army Staff, and I think it's the Prime Minister of Pakistan, along with other civil and military leaders. And the idea is to attract about 25 to 50 billion dollars worth of funding from Saudi Arabia and the UAE for a variety of projects that are range from camel farming, mining, other forms of extraction, and petroleum refinery, and such projects. So look, what I think about this is that this is absolutely not the answer to Pakistan's structural woes of the sort that I think many of us have just described right now. This is no different than CPEC. This is no different than the periodic amnesty schemes that we have. This is no different than the IPP policy of the 1990s, in which the power sector was disbanded and privatized. This periodically, our rulers, when faced with the kinds of crisis that we're talking about, our rulers decide that instead of the serious structural reforms that are necessary, or the complete overhauling of the paradigm that is actually necessary, what they're going to do is try and carve out these tiny windows in which they're going to change the rules and create these one-window operations to bring in a large number of dollars, which will temporarily, definitely, help. The currency will appreciate. Inflation will respond. There will be temporary reprieve. If 25 billion enters the economy in the next however few years, as they're saying, yes, it will lead to temporary reprieve. That temporary reprieve is temporary. And what it will lead us to is a further and further deepening of this crisis that we have been talking about for the last many decades. That's all I want to say about this. Thanks.
Thank you. Umair, did you want to have a go?
Yeah, I think Asha's really hit the nail on the head here. I mean, and Ayaz had actually also mentioned SIFC when he was talking about this idea of conjunctural salvation that the Pakistani ruling bloc tends to reach out to, right? Like these quick fix schemes that really just kick the can down the road. The idea here is that there's a fundamental crisis of the Pakistani political economy. It is both a political crisis of the lack of an absorptive project which is able to include large sections of the population, especially in the peripheral areas, into a national vision of development. And there is a productivity crisis, an economic crisis, which is simply that the productive forces in Pakistan, basic labor and capital, are simply not producing enough that can create a sustained economy that is prosperous and actually redistributes wealth to 250 million citizens. And so SIFC, what it does is it solves a sliver of the problem, and the problem is only of the ruling bloc, which is essentially of the military, and it's the shrinking pie, as Asha had mentioned earlier. If you look at the budget breakup, if more than half is going towards debt servicing, then surely you need external capital in order for simply the state to function and to reappropriate resources for itself. So this is one particular perspective. I know it's a cynical perspective of looking at it, but it really is that. And I just want to sort of add a note of caution here. CPEC and the kind of money that CPEC brought into Pakistan, this is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and all the investment that came through BRI. We're talking about a similar sum. In fact, it was a slightly larger sum, and that gave Pakistan economic breathing space for about 2.5-3 years. 3 years was when the consumption-led boom between 2014 and 2017 actually lasted, and then it went bust in 2018. So we're really just talking about a 3-year period of respite, and even that doesn't necessarily mean meaningful respite for people who are living in, again, the peripheral areas of the provinces. We're largely talking about a gravy train that feeds large urban centers and obviously social networks that are connected to the economy of those geographies, right? So I feel like that is what what the entire state apparatus is currently gearing towards, is to find that next source of geostrategic rent, to use a term that's often used here to describe Pakistan's relationship with the rest of the world, and it's largely based out of the fact that the politics of the current moment preclude anything much more inclusive, long-term, and national envision actually taking place. And yeah, so I think that's what we what we see happening with the SIFC as well.
Ayaz, did you want to?
Yeah, I can add very briefly. I think so. All of these are excellent points. I think the point about the developmental political settlement, development state political settlement, what we must also be mindful of is that when the ISI project was happening in the 50s and 60s and 70s in many parts of the third world, that was also a very different moment for the world system itself, right? This was, what was so-called the golden age of capitalism. There was a consumption boom in the core countries, in the Western countries, the triad, as we call it. And through the 60s, as that long boom then goes into what Robert Brenner calls a long downturn, we see the developmentalism and ISI projects also falling into crisis throughout the third world, which eventually leads to the debt crisis of the 80s and so on and so forth. And then when the integration into neoliberalism happens at the world level, for example, India, China, and so on and so forth, that was also a different kind of moment for the world system itself, right? Now the world system itself, the capitalist economy at a world level, is also in a stagnating phase. It's not the long boom, post-war boom. It's not the momentary respite that financialization gave to the world system through the 80s, 90s, and up to the 2008 financial crisis. So if even the Pakistani state or Pakistani polity ruling bloc goes towards the full-scale IMF-style adjustment and restructuring, I'm not really sure that they would be able to find even long-term, like even medium-term conjunctural salvation, because the worldwide conjuncture has shifted, and again that translates through several mediated ways into the choices which are presented to our ruling bloc and many others.
Thanks, Mahvish.
Or the lack of choices in that sense.
Should I just comment on what was before, or the special, the SIFC?
Well, you're welcome to say what you want, but the question was, what are your views with respect to SIFC? And
I think I'll just say,
and its widened mandate.
I think I'll just say one thing, which is again a historicization of sorts. It has, of course, a predecessor in the National Development Council under Imran Khan. So there was a move towards legalizing the place of the military in economic decision-making beforehand. And before that, again, in, where the place where there is, again, an imagination that certain kinds of bigger development projects will pull Pakistan out, which is through CPEC, in particular, or various kinds of big development projects concentrated especially around Balochistan, but also elsewhere, Third Code or something else. That's there you have, if not legal, then you've long had de facto military decision making. So sometimes there's kind of my own sense is sometimes, how do we differentiate this phase, or how do we differentiate what's before being de facto and has now become a legal position? That's sort of my only thoughts for now.
Did you want to say anything else?
I'm good.
Right. Yasser.
So I think, you've had a lot of rich commentary on this question. So I think I'm happy to defer to the next round of questions as well, because I think you've got much more capable people working in political economy on this group than I am. So I think I've learned more about it than I have to say about it. But yeah, I think I endorse whatever was said so far.
Okay, thank you. Umair?
Yeah, no, I think that those were pretty much my only questions, and I think sort of, I guess, just my parting thoughts on this discussion would be that we, when we think about sort of democracy, we obviously, there are clear institutional, definitional sort of, there's a definitional way of thinking about democracy, which is will elections be held on time, for our fundamental rights protected, and so on. And I think all of those things, and Yasser in particular has highlighted that, we may be in a downturn, but it is likely that we will see judicial resistance at some point. If we go towards an election is incredibly difficult to rig on the polling day now, as opposed to in the past. There is greater scrutiny of electoral activity. So, there will be openings that will move us back towards some idea of a procedural settlement. But I think the fundamental issues that were highlighted, both in terms of the political economy issues of Pakistan's, flailing economic health, and the reasons for its flailing economic health, as well as sort of the uneven developmental and political settlement that exists between the core and the periphery in the country. I think these factors are those long-term trends that will continue to elicit episodic crises. The frequency of those crises might, change. It might be 2 years, 3 years. It might happen every 6 or 8 months. But really, I think what I've learned sort of most vividly from this discussion is that without solving those fundamental issues, one of the uneven militarization of the country, and the second, which is the question of development or of economic growth that is redistributive and prosperity enhancing, I feel like the politics of this, or the democratic question, is also unlikely to be resolved. So they're all very closely imbricated with one another. But I think that's the one thing. So when people ask, is Pakistan going to move out of this crisis? Will we have elections? What is the future of democracy in this country? I'm going to go with Yasser's point about, yes, there will be pushback and there will be openings in the coming months and perhaps coming years. But I feel like the core disease that causes these crises to emerge in such a recurring way, and I think Yas really really nailed down the time frame that this is essentially we're in a 50-year crisis. This isn't a crisis of 6 years or 3 years, or a crisis since April 2022. It's a crisis that has, I would argue, probably has been in place since 74, maybe 77 by some assessments, but it is a 50-year crisis, and it doesn't seem to be coming any closer to a resolution.
Anyone else want to make any closing remarks? We have a few minutes.
I'll jump in quickly. I think the theme of crisis, as all of us know, has always been quite central in scholarship and politics of Pakistan. And a lot of people have reflected on what the place of that crisis is. I mean, there's an interesting kind of take from Sadia Toor in an early book about left politics in Pakistan, that the crisis has also been the reason that you had, and this is maybe a slightly more hopeful note, that you have a kind of democratic opening, which you don't have in, and various, perhaps very fragmented forms of democratic imaginings and debate that have always been part of Pakistani political life, even in the midst of coercion. And if we are going to take Gramsci, right? I mean, one of the arguments around Gramsci is when you do have a national popular will and you have a proper hegemonic project in place, it's almost more difficult to articulate a counter-hegemonic or several counter-hegemonic projects. Whereas in Pakistan, you do have huge levels of fragmentation politically, but it's also been a kind of a ground for these kind of imaginings. So that's something that we'll be thinking about for a long time. And I think that Pakistani scholarship in particular, I think, and this is the final thing I want to say, is it's also a place to think about the crisis on a world scale as well, because we have produced over time quite a lot of writings and thinking about what politics is. I think there's some work in terms of scholarship to maybe break some of the hermetic ceiling that exists in debates about Pakistan, to think about what it tells us about other places rather than what other places tell us about Pakistan. But that's a side point.
Thank you very much. Yasser?
Yeah, I just want to add, like, I guess it's more of like a question that I guess I'm thinking about that I obviously we cannot answer here, but I thought it's a question to just put out there. I mean, I guess, I agree with, a lot of what's been talked about in terms of sort of this problem of creating the kind of ruling bloc that would be amenable to more development, unless, and sort of this sort of, and as we had discussed over here, and sort of the preeminence of the military in the current ruling bloc that we have. But one thought I had is that, at least in my sort of, I guess, learning and understanding of Pakistan's politics, there has been, and I feel like it's also the kind of priors that maybe our mainstream political parties have operated with, as we've seen, which is a sort of combination of understanding how constituency-based politics works and how it interacts with, sort of your particular patronage structures, and how it interacts with how inter-institutional elite bargaining can and cannot be done at the center, right? So you have constituencies, you win elections. This is how you win elections. This is how you consolidate power at the constituency level, and this is what structures the way in which you bargain for more power at the center with the military, etc. Right? That particular dynamic of politics, as we understand it, but then I think some of the points raised here today have been also about sort of this growing incoherence, the growing problem of the absorptive capacity of the state, etc., that kind of created this moment for this populist upsurge of Imran Khan. And I guess the question is, do we also now need to revisit the ways in which constituency politics and bargaining at the institutional level intersect and interact going forward? Is it something different now? And have these political parties, other political parties we've had in place so far, in the place that they are, because they're operating on a problematic model of how constituency politics relates to inter-institutional elite politics in a way that is making them increasingly either irrelevant or unable to adapt to the changing dynamics of Pakistani politics. So I guess maybe we need a different theorization, a new understanding of how that relationship is shifting over time. Yeah.
Ayaz, did you want to say something just by way of closing remarks?
No, I think on this question, we have two of our foremost experts here on constituency politics, Umair and Asha, so they should be saying something for Yasser's question.
That was the point.
Asha, you have the last word.
No, I think actually I'm not going to address that at all. And all I will say is that this entire discussion is making me think a great deal about the need to understand strategic agency within these dominant structures much more seriously. And I think that's an entire scholarly project that, I'm not saying something that we can do here, but it seems to me that, there's obviously, as I think Ayaz put it really well, we have these two paths to walk. But even within those, there's space for, there's trajectories, there's pathways, and there's roads taken and that will be taken, not taken. And so I think it's worth exploring, and maybe it's a conversation we can have later informally at some point, but exploring the strategic agency of actors within these dominant structures.
Thank you very much. This has been absolutely wonderful, and I have only learned from this, and has been a brilliant start to our new academic years and new terms series of events. For those of you interested in our other events, please do go to our website or follow us on social media, and we post everything over there. A special word of thanks to all of you, all panelists, and to you, Umair, for putting this event together. I say this often, and yet every time I do actually mean it when I say it, is that, we do these events regularly, and and if there's been anything good that has come out of the pandemic, it is that we've all become tech savvy and we've all come to know what Zoom is about. But it does not take away from the fact that all of you give freely of your time and your expertise. Everyone, all of you are busy, all of you have other things to do, but we can't do these events without the generosity of your time and your knowledge. And yet I continue to believe that it does make a difference to our audience and those who listen and learn and come back and question. So thank you very much, everyone, very, very sincerely. Yasser Kureshi in Oxford, Asha Amirali in Bath, Ayaz Malik in Liverpool, Umair currently over here, but otherwise at LUMS, and Mahvish, my colleague. Thank you very much and goodbye.